If you've looked at the repositories that we have in the Sourcegraph organization on GitHub, you'll see that we have a lot of repositories. There's the main repository, Sourcegraph/Sourcegraph, and that contains the main codebase. I talk about that in the codebase tour video. But what are all these other repositories? What are these secondary repositories? Which ones are important to know about? Let's take a look. Along the way, I'm going to share a few Sourcegraph search tips for searching across multiple repositories. So we'll take a look at that. Let's start with this question. Why do we have so many repositories? Look at this relatively, I think, significant number of repositories, and that's just counting our public repositories. Well, the simple answer is that we have quite a lot of libraries, tools, and other projects that are not included in the main repository for various reasons. Some of them are relevant to the product, but some of them are just tools and utilities that are not directly related to the main product at all. Now, not all of these repos are actually active. Many of them are forks of things that we are no longer actively using, or they're archived legacy repos that are not really maintained, but we keep them around. So that's part of where the big number comes from. We're not going to walk through the entire list, so I want to talk about a selection of the more important repositories that you may want to know about, and I'll tell you a bit about what's in them. So this is a great time to talk about using Sourcegraph to search for repositories using the Repo Filter. As an example, when you're searching for public repositories on GitHub, you can use the autocomplete helper to search for repos belonging to a particular user or organization. In this case, we can enter Sourcegraph as the organization and we'll search over all of our repos. I'll add a keyword to search for here, for example, Docker. The results show me all the places where the keyword was found across all of the organization's repositories. Okay, on to some specific repos. The About repo contains the About website. So this includes all of the marketing pages and landing pages. The repo also contains the blog. There are some other important pages here, like the terms of service. And overall, there's a lot of content in here. And in fact, the blog content goes back quite a few years. The About website is located at about.sourcegraph.com, and the blog is at about.sourcegraph.com/blog. The handbook repository contains the Sourcegraph company handbook. Every page in the handbook is contained in this repo as a markdown file in the content directory. The website's code is in here too. It's actually a Next.js stack and it gets deployed to Netlify. You can run it locally too. The instructions are here in the README. The handbook has a built-in search function, but if it's not finding what you're looking for, here's a search tip. You can actually use Sourcegraph to search the handbook too. You just need to use the repo filter with the handbook repo and then put in your keywords. By default, Sourcegraph searches for the entire exact phrase. The main branch of this repo is automatically deployed to handbook.sourcegraph.com. The handbook is entirely public, and that's part of our open and transparent company culture. The handbook also reflects our company value of high agency. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you see anything that could be improved or clarified in the handbook, as a Sourcegraph teammate, you should feel free to open a pull request and make a change. You don't need to ask anyone permission to make a change to the company handbook. You can just go ahead. Although that being said, you should still request a review before merging changes. Sourcegraph Learn is another one of our content sites, and it hosts tutorials and educational content. There are quite a few tutorials here about Sourcegraph search syntax and about how Git works, and a few other topics. One cool fact about the site is that the code of the site, which is built with Next.js, is open source and the written content is under a Creative Commons license. We also have some great video content here, so check that out. You can find the Sourcegraph Learn website at learn.sourcegraph.com. There are multiple repos that have names that start with deploy. These deploy repositories exist for different deployment options for Sourcegraph instances. Here's one of the installation pages in the docs. So this is what we mean by deployment types. You can do a search to find all deploy repositories by using the repo filter. The repo filter is actually a regular expression, so we can modify the search query that we used earlier to match any repo in the organization that starts with deploy and is followed by anything that's represented by the $* pattern. Here is Zuct. Zuct is a code search engine that is an important part of Sourcegraph code search. It's based on trigram indexing. Zuct is an open source project that originated at Google, and Sourcegraph has contributed to the project a lot. And eventually in November 2021, we took over maintainership of the project. There's a blog post on our blog about the backstory behind the project. It's a pretty interesting post that's worth reading. And we also have a great article on the blog about how we were able to achieve some significant memory optimizations over time. So I can only talk about public repositories in this video. The good news is that most Sourcegraph repositories are public, and that's because we're an open and transparent company. Our infrastructure repository, that's one of the exceptions. It's a private repository for security reasons, basically. It contains things like configuration, scripts, and resources for running our infrastructure. We also have several private deployment repositories for the same reasons. And on top of that, any information that has to do with customers, that's also kept in private repositories. LSIF is the language server index format. So it's the format that powers the implementation of code intelligence in Sourcegraph. The Code Intel team maintains LSIF indexers for the languages that we support, and each of these indexers has its own repository. Here's LSIF TypeScript, for example. That's the indexer that handles TypeScript, and there are several others. All of the LSIF repos use the same naming conventions. They start with LSIF. So once again, we can modify the organization search to give us all repos that start with LSIF. Here you can see that there is one for each language. Source CLI is the Sourcegraph CLI tool. It's a way to interact with Sourcegraph instances from the command line. So in a way, it's a layer over the API. Keep in mind that this is the end user tool for using Sourcegraph, and our other command line tool called SG is our internal developer tool. The SG repo contains releases of the SG developer tool in the releases tab. It doesn't actually contain any code at all. The code for SG is in the main repo. So we just use this repository to host releases because, well, in the main repository, we're already using the releases tab to host Sourcegraph releases. So SG releases are hosted here. This is the Sourcegraph extensions registry. Sourcegraph extensions are like editor extensions, but they're created to extend the Sourcegraph UI, and they use the Sourcegraph extension API. There are quite a few repos that contain Sourcegraph extensions. Some of them have been developed by third-party developers, so they aren't only found within the Sourcegraph organization. Now let's look at a search tip for how to find those repos, and I'll show you two different ways. First, sometimes a repo's readme file can tell you a lot. So with the file filter, we can specify that we're looking for file names matching readme, and then we'll put the keywords that we're looking for, Sourcegraph extension. That's because we expect that to show up in the readme of a Sourcegraph extension. We get the results from each file, but in this case, we might just want a list of repositories instead of seeing every match, so we can modify this search with the select filter. Now we get a list of just the repositories. Now here's the second way to find a collection of repos, and it's by using a dependency. We happen to know that Sourcegraph extensions all depend on the Sourcegraph module inside of their package file. By the way, we can optionally start the search with the Repo Filter. Then we use the file filter to look inside of package.json files. And finally, the keyword is the Sourcegraph dependency, in quotes like this. The colon is part of the search. So you can see Sourcegraph showing up inside of the dependency lists here. That's what we want. But again, I would use select repo because that gives us just the list of repos that we're looking for. And that's what we get here in the results. So that's how you can do a dependency search. Now you might come across these shared configuration repos like ESLint config and prettier RC. ESLint is a code linting tool, and Prettier is a code formatting tool, and these repos contain the common configuration files that we use in all of our code bases. So we use these tools to keep the code consistent. That's it for the tour of our secondary repositories. We learned about several of the more important or more active repositories in the Sourcegraph organization on GitHub. And we also learned a bit about searching for repositories using the repo filter, the select operator, and using the file filter too to specify file names that we want to search for. And finally, we looked at an example of when it's useful to search for keywords in readme files. After watching this, I invite you to go to the video description below and submit the feedback form that's linked there. I'll also add links to all the repositories that we looked at and all the search queries that I mentioned.